Okay, this is going to be our first set of notes for our unit on ancient Greece, and this will be our last set of notes before winter break. We're going to cover the early Greeks today, including their geography, and we're going to focus on two groups of early Greeks, the Mycenaeans and the Dorians. Greece is a mountainous peninsula located by the Aegean Sea. We call this peninsula the Balkan Peninsula. And around Greece, we have 2,000 smaller islands. We've talked about one of them already, and that was the island of Crete, where the Minoans lived. Because the land was so rocky, the Greeks will rarely live far from the coast. They can't live inland where we have the mountains because the land is too rocky to farm on. The Aegean Sea, which is to the east of Greece, the Ionian to the west, and the Black Seas will become very important for the Greeks. Because they have such a hard time farming, they will instead become skilled sailors and traders. And they will eventually control the Mediterranean like the Minoans and the Phoenicians before them. So 3/4 of Greece is mountainous, and that gives them very little farmland to work with. They would develop small independent communities rather than one united Greek culture. We really don't talk about a Greek kingdom or a Greek empire, at least not until the time of Alexander. Instead, we would get city-states, much like we saw in Mesopotamia or in the Phoenician homeland. Transportation was difficult on land, so instead they would move about using the sea. Limited arable land meant that they could only support small-scale farming, and therefore only have a small population in these city-states. That word arable, we've seen it before, it means farmable. So because of the mountains, we have very little farmable land. The one thing the Greeks had going for them was a very nice climate. Okay, we call it a Mediterranean climate. It does not get too hot in the summertime and not too cold in the winter. And this allows for an outdoor lifestyle, meaning we can have discussions, which eventually leads to town meetings and will become part of the political system. And over in that picture in the corner, we've got olives. Olives and olive oil will become a hot commodity for the Greeks. So when we look at this map of Greece, we need to know that everything, part of this landmass in the corner, is called the Balkan Peninsula. To the west, we've got the Ionian Sea, which separates Greece from Italy. Over here to the east, we've got the Aegean Sea. And when we look at this map, the green areas around the coast, that's where we have our farmable land. Okay, the brown, the tan areas, those are the mountains. That's where people are not able to farm. That's why we see so many of the cities right next to the coast, the only areas that we can farm. The first Greek-speaking people are called the Mycenaeans, and they were Indo-Europeans, much like the other groups we had talked about, the Aryans, the Hittites, and they're going to migrate into Greece around 2000 BCE. Their main city was Mycenae, and they're going to dominate Greece for about 500 years, from 1600 to 1100 BCE. They lived in separate city-states, and each city-state was ruled by a warrior king. And with this group of people, the stronger you were, the more power you had. Okay, much like we saw with Aryan society. But over time, they became sea traders. They realized that they just didn't have a lot of resources due to the mountainous environment they lived in, so they turned to the sea to get what they needed. So their main city was Mycenae, located on what we call the Peloponnesus Peninsula. It's a little offshoot of the rest of the Balkan Peninsula. It's not an island because it's connected to the rest of the Balkan Peninsula. And looking at the arrows on the map, they're going towards Anatolia. This is where the Mycenaeans would go to trade and get the goods that they needed to survive. So they would cross the Aegean Sea by boat, and they would establish colonies in Anatolia. Mycenae was located in southern Greece and was an extremely fortified city. Unlike the Minoans who lived on the island of Crete, the Mycenaeans were very much afraid of outsiders, and they knew that their neighbors were also warlike people. We said that a warrior king ruled the people of Mycenae, but there were other strong cities like Tiryns and eventually Athens, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about coming up. So once again, we've got Mycenae on a map. We have the ruins of the city in the bottom left-hand corner. And from those ruins, we've got an artist depiction of what the city would have looked like during its height. And notice that they were pretty smart. They actually built their city right back up to a cliff, and that provided them an extra layer of protection. They didn't have to build walls quite so high behind them because it would be very difficult for them to be attacked from those cliffs. If you've played Assassin's Creed Origins, and I always go back to video games, they did a very nice job of making a replica of the city of Mycenae based on the ruins that were found. So if you ever have a chance to play that game, they have a tour mode, and you can look at each of those cities like Mycenae, Athens, Sparta, and see what they would have looked like during that time period. We think the Mycenaeans and the Minoans came into contact with each other around 1500 BCE. And it's there that the Mycenaeans learned the value of sea trade and shipbuilding. Before meeting the Minoans, they were simple warriors, but they learned a lot from the Minoans. They adopted the Minoan writing system, as well as taking on parts of Minoan culture, like art, literature. They even took on religion and politics from the Minoans. And we think that they may have gone on to conquer the Minoans who lived on the island of Crete. We know that the Minoans faced some sort of natural disaster, possibly an earthquake or tidal wave, and we think that the Mycenaeans kind of cleaned up the mess and took over Crete. In the 1200s BCE, the Mycenaeans would fight a 10-year war against the city of Troy. Troy was a trading city located in Anatolia, and they controlled two important straits, the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Strait. The Dardanelles would be important in World War I. You'll talk about that next year. And the Bosporus Strait would eventually become a capital for another empire. So both of these straits are important locations, and they're strategic in that if you hold them, you control trade going from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And we think that's why the Mycenaeans went to war over this land. So we've got the lands of the Mycenaeans, and we've got Troy. This is the strait that's known as the Dardanelles. There's a very famous World War I battle fought there. If you were to continue going east on this map to the other side of the Sea of Marmara, you would get to the Bosporus Strait. So we think that the Mycenaeans wanted to take control of the strait to control trade. People who pass through this area, you get to tax them and you become rich. A legendary story was created based on this war between the Mycenaeans and the Trojans. And they said that this battle was fought because a Trojan prince named Paris had kidnapped Helen, the beautiful wife of a Greek king. The Mycenaeans would go on to Troy to try to save her and ended up fighting the Trojans for 10 years. And according to this story, in this war, they were at a deadlock. Neither side was able to win. So the Greeks turned to treachery and tricked the Trojans by building a wooden horse, which was a sign of peace and also an offering to the god Poseidon, because the Greeks were going to get on their ships and sail home. In this story, the Trojans would then carry this horse into their city. They would celebrate. They would drink a little too much, and many of the residents of the city of Troy would end up falling asleep, passing out. And inside the horse, we know that there were soldiers on the Mycenaean side of the war, and they would open up the city gates. The Mycenaeans had not actually sailed back home. They actually hid themselves so that the Trojans thought they were gone. And that's how the Mycenaeans were able to take the city of Troy. They burned it to the ground. Now, historians originally thought this Trojan War was fictional. It was created by storytellers from that time period. But in the 1870s, an archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann uncovered Troy, and he argued that this war actually happened. And modern studies now show that there was a war in this area and during that time period, but the actual events are unclear. We don't know why this war erupted, but we're guessing it was over the Dardanelles and controlling that trade route. So Schliemann was able to excavate the city of Troy. And what actually happens with some of these older cities is they build right on top of each other. Okay, some of the stuff gets covered up and they build on top of it. And he was able to go all the way back to the ruins that were built in the Bronze Age. And today we're able to confirm that, yes, a lot of these structures were burned to the ground. And we can see the aftermath of a war. Shortly after the Trojan War, the Mycenaean civilization collapsed. And as we've seen many times before, when one civilization collapses, another takes its place. And the group that would migrate into Greece were the Dorians. And they had migrated from the Caucasus Mountain region and would slowly, over generations and generations, move through the steppe and eventually settle into Greece. The Dorians spoke a Greek dialect, but they were less advanced than the Mycenaeans who had previously inhabited Greece. Because of that, the economy in Greece collapsed and people stopped trading. Under the Dorians, the Greeks also lost the art of writing. We have no written records for about 400 years, from 1150 to 750 BCE. So we call this the Dark Ages of Greece. There weren't very many innovations or new technologies being created by the Dorians, and it's kind of kept us as historians in the dark because we don't have any written records, so we don't know exactly what was going on. Because they couldn't read or write, under the Dorians, history was learned through the spoken word. Stories were passed down from generation to generation. They did have storytellers, and these storytellers were called bards, which is a vocab word that you're going to need to know. So a bard is a Greek storyteller, and the greatest of these bards was considered to be Homer. We don't know if Homer actually existed, but he is given credit for creating 2 epic poems. We've talked about epics. What was our first epic that we've ever heard about in this class? It was created in Sumer. And it is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, and we know that we have modern day epics like the Marvel movies and Star Wars and Harry Potter. Okay, he ends up creating the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad was the story of the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, which you guys will read in your English class, was about the journey home of Odysseus, one of the soldiers on the Greek side of the Trojan War, and all the trials and tribulations that he faced. These were created sometime between 750 and 700 BCE, and eventually written down later. So Homer is given credit for these stories, but we don't know if Homer was a real person. He might be a legendary figure, and some even say that he was blind. In these two epics, Homer took pieces of Greek mythology to flesh out the stories, make them more fantastical. In the Odyssey, the Greek hero Odysseus ends up getting stranded on the island of the Cyclopes, and he ends up facing off against the Cyclops Polyphemus. We won't spoil too much of the story since you're going to read it in English class this year. But a human can't really stand up to a Cyclops, so instead Odysseus uses his wits to end up getting himself off of the island with his soldiers. A few of them do get eaten by the Cyclops because if you're a Cyclops, that's just what you do. Of course, these Cyclops have one eye in the middle of their head. That's what they see out of. So for the Greeks, strength is not the most important virtue. Instead, especially in Athens, it's about using your wits. And we'll see Greek virtues in their mythology. Myths are traditional stories about the gods. Homer's works and the book Theogony by Hesiod are the main sources of this mythology for us today. That's how we know so much about Greek mythology. The Greeks gave their gods humanistic qualities and fought constantly with each other. It's almost like watching a soap opera or professional wrestling. Okay, even though they were family, the gods would get into fights with each other and then eventually make up sometimes. So if we have gods, what type of religion do we have in Greece? And yes, our term for that would be polytheistic, having many gods. So the term polytheistic, which we've been using since we first had civilization in our class, is actually a Greek word. The gods were meant to explain the mysteries of nature. They don't have the science and technology to explain why there's a thunderstorm, so Zeus must be mad and hurling thunderbolts at the earth. The gods and goddesses would live forever on Mount Olympus, and they would interfere in the lives of men in these stories, usually for the worst. So Mount Olympus is an actual place in the Balkan Peninsula. The Greeks couldn't reach the top of it, and it was usually covered in clouds, so that's where they said the gods lived. Of course, now that we've been to the top, we haven't seen these gods, so maybe the Greeks weren't onto something after all. So finally, how did the Greeks maintain a national identity? Remember, we had said the Greeks were not united. They were not one kingdom or one empire. Instead, they were separate city-states, each having their own government. But what brings them together are the bards, these traveling poets and storytellers who would go from city-state to city-state, telling stories and picking up new stories and spreading them. They believed in the same mythology, the same religion, which provided a sense of national identity, and they had a strong oral tradition, teaching and spreading culture through stories. But what makes them Greek is their language. They all speak the Greek language. There might be dialects, but they can all understand each other, and that's what makes them Greek. So that's going to be it for notes for this class and for the year of 2020.